Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Querétaro, Mexico, I'm Nick Zautra. I'm recording the introduction to this podcast in Querétaro, a colonial city just 3 hours north of Mexico City. I'm currently taking a post-finals vacation after having completed my fourth year in the PhD program in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine at Indiana University. I'm very happy to report that the spring semester went exceedingly well in terms of research and teaching, and I'm very much looking forward to, well, first enjoying this brief vacation, and then second, turning my attention to the dissertation proposal. So I hope you listeners out there also had a very nice spring, whether it be in the academic setting or at work or wherever you might be. Okay, well, let's turn to introducing our guest for today. Our guest today is Dr. Richard Dawid, professor of philosophy at the University of Stockholm in Sweden. Richard's philosophical interests are focused on two related fields of research. So in the context of the philosophy of physics, Richard works on understanding and specifying philosophical implications of contemporary fundamental physics, with a special emphasis on high-energy physics and cosmology. An important philosophical question that arises in those fields is concerned with the epistemic character of lines of reasoning that are not directly based on empirical data. Such strategies are essential for understanding the notions of empirical confirmation and discovery in empirically testable high-energy physics. So this can be exemplified by the case of the discovery, for example, of the Higgs particle. Moreover, non-empirical argumentative strategies also play a crucial role in assessing the status of theories which are empirically unconfirmed, but nevertheless have attained an influential position in physics. So the prime example for such a theory is, I'm sure you've heard of it, string theory. So Richard is working on spelling out the structure of these different modes of reasoning in the context of specific scientific theories. But at a more general level, Richard tries to argue that non-empirical modes of reasoning, which can be isolated in the context of specific physical theories, actually shed new light on a number of issues in the general philosophy of science and in epistemology. So non-empirical theory assessment, Richard argues, can be formalized in a way that leads to an extended notion of theory confirmation in a Bayesian framework. It also suggests a new perspective on the classical question of novel confirmation, and eventually it leads to a new take on the question of scientific realism. So therefore, much of Richard's work, and much of what we'll get to talk about in this interview, is related to developing a philosophical framework that can both account for the role of non-empirical theory assessment in specific physical theories and cover the wider philosophical context where it is embedded. So I'm very pleased to introduce Richard. He was a wonderful guest to interview. Actually, back a few months ago, we discussed him, and it was just now that we're finally getting to release his wonderful chat. And I'm happy to report that this is our first interview with someone who is currently teaching and doing research at a university outside of the United States. So I'm hoping to certainly, as this podcast moves along, include more and more of these folks from the international community, such that this podcast can be equally representative of the international community that is the philosophy of science. Okay, then. Well, without further ado, let's bring in Richard. All right, well, welcome, Richard Dawid. I'm sorry, I didn't even ask. What's the best pronunciation of your...
That was absolutely perfect.
Wow. Okay, that is a first for me. Then I'm very, very happy. Richard, great. We have Richard Dawid of Stockholm, Sweden, the Department of Philosophy, joining us on the Sci-Fi Podcast. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
I'm very happy to have you. So joining us on this fine Tuesday morning, afternoon. How is it in Stockholm today?
Well, it's a little rainy and cold, I must say.
Oh, okay. Is winter starting up there? Yeah.
Days are getting very short already.
Yeah, sure. I bet. Well, great. Well, very interested in getting to know getting to know you on this podcast and how you got into philosophy of science, how you came to be working on some very interesting issues in philosophy of physics. So Richard, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Austria, in Vienna.
Okay.
And I also lived in Vienna during most of my studying period. So I started doing physics at the University of Vienna.
Well, so what was growing up? What were mom and dad doing? What were they up to?
My father was in banking.
Okay.
And my mother stayed at home and cared for the children. I still have one brother.
Okay.
She was at home with the two of us.
Very nice. Is a brother in? What was brother in? Older or younger?
He is 3 years younger, and he's also in academia. He's doing economics in Germany.
Oh, wow! All right, very nice. So, as you growing up, was science, was physics something you were interested in, or was this something that came to at a later time?
It was, I think, from age 11, 12 onwards, I found physics interesting. And but the idea that I would study physics and try to become a physicist was slowly developing throughout my high school years.
Yeah. How do you think that came to be throughout high school? What do you recall any particular experiences you might have had with physics, with research?
Not really. I was interested in physics for quite general reasons. I think I always tried to ask the most general, most fundamental questions.
Yeah.
And I felt that physics was the field where you find answers. And so that's why I went into physics, and that's why I eventually went into theoretical physics, because I thought that's the most fundamental way of doing physics.
Did you have a favorite physicist or author at the time who was writing about theoretical physics?
Well, obviously I was impressed by people like Weinberg or Feynman, and I wrote some of their popular books.
Yeah. I think like physics is one of the fields that seems that, in particular in the sciences and philosophy of science, where there is a great abundance of popular science books that make the field more accessible. Whereas in certain kinds of the philosophy of sciences, you might see a couple popular books, but physics really has the market on those. I think maybe more so. I think the neurosciences might be coming in age with these kinds of books. Of popular science, but physics has definitely been around in that regard.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right, so you went where did you do your first study, undergraduate in the U.S. First course of study at university?
That was the University of Vienna.
Oh, very nice. I happen to go. Do you happen to know anything about their? I don't know. They have a philosophy of science. I imagine they have some philosophy of science stuff, but they have like a summer school out there.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Yeah. They have a summer school.
Yeah. I happen to go just a couple. Visu or Scientific World Conceptions or something. Yeah.
Okay, so you've been there.
I went there. I went there a couple years ago, actually. The summer of 2014. They were doing it on. Human-animal boundaries. I have some general interest in animal modeling and the use of animals in scientific experiments. And they were doing they brought together this really interesting collection of philosophers, historians, religious studies scholars, English lit folks. It was a hodgepodge of scholars generally interested in animals. But it was very nice, just being in the context of which the Vienna Circle, logical positivism, and Vienna, which is like an amazing city.
So. Yeah, I do think that this grand past is a considerable asset Vienna has with respect to the philosophy of science. It can relate to that tradition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's something about it. I don't really know. So I was going to ask. So you went into the field? Was this physics or philosophy that you began in?
That was physics.
Okay.
So at that time, I was not thinking about doing philosophy or being a philosopher. So I was really focusing on physics, all the way up to doing my PhD in physics.
Oh wow! Okay, so
and even after having finished my PhD, I went to Berkeley as a physicist and was there for
wow. Okay,
3 years.
Very nice. So
still in high energy physics before I switched to philosophy.
Sure. So what kinds of questions in the undergraduate at University of Vienna were you interested in physics?
So I studied quantum field theory and general relativity, but mostly focusing on quantum field theory, standard model of particle physics, things like that.
Okay.
So I was fascinated by those questions.
All right. So by the time had you set your mind that theoretical physics is the thing? This is what you'd like to go into?
Yeah, at the time that was the idea.
Okay.
I wanted to become a theoretical physicist. And then I spent 2 years in Munich. It was an exciting time in physics during my PhD.
Oh, okay. So did you do university and then master's program at Vienna, or?
Well, yes. Well, at the time, the structure of studies at the university was a little different. You didn't have a master's program actually.
Mm-hmm.
First and the second, what do you call it, Studienabschnitt, and after that you would get a kind of a master's degree, which was at the time called Magister, so
mm-hmm.
German expression, and after the Magister you would do a PhD, a doctorate.
Okay. And so you went to Munich. Which school was that?
That was the Technical University.
Okay. Very nice. How do you like it there?
I liked it very much. I thought it was in physics at the time. It was a very open atmosphere, very very supportive, and I liked it better than in Vienna. I must say, in Vienna at the time.
Okay. What distinguished that? You said it was more supportive, more open. What made Munich a little bit better than Vienna for you?
Well, I think Munich back then and also today is one of the maybe the most important academic city in the German-speaking world. So a lot of things in physics and also in philosophy, I think, are focused in Munich, and I liked that back at the time. So things were happening. There were interesting people, different ideas. So I enjoyed that a lot. And even more so than going to Berkeley. So Berkeley was really a fantastic place at the time. I'm sure it still is.
Yeah. So how did the transition over to Berkeley come about?
Well, after having finished, or when I was in the process of finishing my PhD, I thought I wanted to go to the United States, and so I applied for a research fellowship, 2-year research fellowship at Berkeley, and on that basis, I went to Berkeley.
Okay. And what was it about doing physics in the United States that drew you, as opposed to the kind of work that was going on in Germany, or situating yourself in Germany?
I felt that the most interesting developments were happening in the United States, and also being there at the time, that was definitely true. There were, in particular in Berkeley, there were lots of very interesting developments going on at the time. So there were very interesting things in string theory going on. There were,
Well, yeah, what kinds of things? What kinds of claims were being made at the time?
Well, in string theory, so that was the late 1990s, and in string theory, that was the time when, after the second, what is called the second string revolution. So that was the time when string dualities were much better understood, and it was understood that they play an essential role in the theory. So string dualities are basically the idea that very different, seemingly entirely different formulations of the theory are empirically equivalent. And that's the case with respect to different types of the theory, but it's also, even more excitingly, it's the case with respect to string theory proper, or a certain kind of string theory, and different, the quantum field theory that isn't even a string theory, but it turns out that they are empirically equivalent. And all those developments, which are still very influential in string physics today, started in the late 1990s. So it was a really exciting period to be there and to witness those.
Yeah, so I mean, in the 1990s string theory, which we've come to know in popular physics circles, as one of the very bigger conceptual frameworks that theoretical physics is potentially built on. I know that's changed perhaps in recent times, but what was it like? How was string theory being received back then?
At that time there was quite some euphoria about the theory. So the idea was, or the perception was, that those new developments would mean that one can attain a much better understanding of the theory, and it was seen as a real breakthrough. And after that, the last decade or so, it turned out that things are getting very difficult, very complicated. Mm-hmm. And at this point, it's less clear, less obvious where the field is heading, and what the next step in the theory or in the field is going to be. So now at this point, I would think there is more. The situation is less clear and probably less optimistic than it was in the late 90s.
So if you were a theoretical physicist, was it more likely than not that you would be working in some capacity on string theory?
Well, I myself didn't work on string theory because in Austria, where I started, there was no string theory at the time. Okay. And so I was when I came to Berkeley, I was interested in the theory, but I didn't do research myself in that field.
So what was your plan? What were you thinking of doing at Berkeley?
So I was doing what is called particle physics model building.
Okay.
It is also very conceptual work. It is also to a considerable extent speculative, one may say, but it is not string theory proper. It's not based on the basic posit of string theory that there are extended elementary objects. Those are called strings. But what I was doing was based on the paradigm of point-like elementary particles.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And this kind of work, I see. So I was checking out your CV. So you have it separated into philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, but then high energy physics and cosmology. So I imagine separate journals, a very different style of writing or a different focus, similar content, but different.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, as doing, maybe this will become clear when you start describing the shift to philosophy of physics. But so, how would you describe the distinction between theoretical physics and philosophy of physics?
There are huge differences, I would say, both in style and in content. The remarkable or conspicuous difference I felt when I moved from physics to philosophy of science. It was the different pace. Because in physics, there is this day-to-day rhythm of reading the new papers on the archive and trying to understand whether that's something you can connect to, you can use for your own work. So it's very much focused on the very small time spans, I would say. While in the philosophy of science, the developments are not as fast.
Sure.
So you have more time to develop your ideas.
Yeah, there's not as much of a urgency in which to, or even staying up with every single kind of publication that's coming out, or you do have. I would say that's the case, perhaps in other kinds of things.
Yeah, it's not that much of a race that you have to fear that if you lose some time, someone else will do the work or publish the work you intended to. Things like that.
Sure. Okay. So
of course, it can also happen in the philosophy of science, but it's
of course, that's not. So you're at Berkeley and you're doing high energy particle physics and cosmology. So what came next? What was what started leading toward the transition to philosophy of physics?
So when I was first, what I should mention is that I was always kind of interested in philosophy. I didn't consider it my main field of interest, but I was interested. I went to some philosophy classes in Vienna and Munich, and I had discussions with philosophers and so with philosophy students, one may say. So I did have some affinity, let's say, to philosophy.
Cool.
And when I was at Berkeley, and I was really fascinated by those developments in string physics, I had the impression that there is an interesting philosophical issue there, and I felt that would be interesting to look into more closely. So that was the initial reason to start thinking about looking at the theory seriously from a philosophical perspective.
Mm-hmm. So, well, that's certainly interesting. You were at Berkeley, and where did you end up next?
So then it was a period where I tried to make up my mind what to do next after Berkeley.
Sure.
And so I had the growing impression that it would be an interesting idea to try doing philosophy, which of course in that situation was not an easy decision, because you decide to an entirely different field and it's very unclear how it works out and so on. But then it happened that I had a friend, a philosopher at Berkeley, and he brought me together with a philosopher in Vienna. And on that basis, I could submit a research project in philosophy in Vienna.
Mm.
And that's what I did. And that was the reason why I went back to Vienna then and started doing philosophy in Vienna.
Yeah, I see. So, and you didn't go back for a second PhD. But
I did not. That was also, of course, a question. I had to decide whether to do a PhD in philosophy or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. The reason why I did not do that was that I had a fairly specific idea about what to do in philosophy, and I thought it would be more. I would have more freedom for doing specifically what I wanted to do without doing a PhD. That was my idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not entirely sure whether that was a good or a bad decision, but from a today's perspective, I do see that I did have a point, that it would have had advantages, but also disadvantages to do a second PhD.
Sure, yeah. What do you think? So I can certainly see the advantages of, well, as a researcher, as someone more professional coming in, having that experience, knowing what you want to do, and then also it seeming like this isn't something where, all of a sudden, here's this other field I want to go into. I mean, this has kind of been in the background all along, it sounds like, throughout your work. What do you feel you might have missed out on, having not done philosophy, more or less focused graduate work in philosophy?
You mean what I would have, what would have been different if I had done a PhD in philosophy? That's
sure. And I should actually say that because I know, so outside of U.S. graduate programs, U.S. graduate programs are typically, they have a lot of, they're very course heavy. So they try, so the first 2 or 3 years are very set on grounding you in some of the previous work. And it's interesting because I've talked to a lot of philosophers of science who admit they don't really have a lot of, they didn't take the time really to do a lot of, history of philosophy or things like that because it's not as essential to the work that they do, or they just weren't really interested in it, to be honest. And that's fine. I'm fine with that. And so, I was just curious about your own,
I think there would have been two main advantages doing a PhD. First, it would have been much easier for me to get to know the topical contemporary ideas in the philosophy of science.
Sure.
In Vienna, that wasn't very easy because there was no real philosophy of science going on in Vienna at the time. There was history of philosophy of science, but not much philosophy of science. And of course, being part of a PhD program would have made that much easier, and it would also made it easier probably to get connections to philosophers of science and to the philosophy of science community and so on. And that both was rather difficult in Vienna at the time. So when I was doing this in Vienna, I was fairly, for quite some years, I was fairly detached from the philosophy of science, from the worldwide philosophy of science community, I would say. I did have some connections, but not that many. So that were clearly disadvantages. The advantage was that, or let's say the problem I would have had if I had started a PhD was that at the time there was no one in the philosophy of science really interested in string theory.
And what were they interested in instead?
Philosophy of science or philosophy of physics was still quite focused on the foundational debate in quantum mechanics, some quantum field theory, space and time. So the classical ideas in the philosophy.
Sure.
There was not that much gauge field theory, a little bit, but not much. There was nearly no string theory. There was very little modern cosmology. And there was a reason for that, actually, a conceptual reason, one may say. And the reason was that philosophy of physics understood itself as a discipline that should deal with mature theories that are well established. And the idea was that those modern theories that hadn't been empirically confirmed, like string theory or some ideas in cosmology, they were not in sufficiently well developed and sufficiently well established for becoming a topic for the philosophy of physics. That was, I think, it's fair to say that was the general sentiment at the time.
Sure.
While for me, the idea was that exactly this point, exactly the point that those theories are not well established according to traditional conceptions of the philosophy of science, was what was philosophically interesting, because those theories were very influential. They played a very important role in the field without having those merits.
Sure.
And so for me, the idea was that's what I want to do philosophically. While in the philosophy of physics, there was no one who would have shared that perspective. So my feeling is that, let's say, the risk would have been there that the PhD program where I would have ended up in would have been an obstacle to freely choosing the perspective I wanted to choose.
Okay, very well put. I find it very interesting that the focus not on modern theories. I don't know if I know in, for example, philosophy of cognitive science or philosophy of biology. I think there's certainly the case that they don't. I don't think they have anything set in stone kinds of things other than, let's say, evolutionary theory that people obviously will continue to work on, but. There's certainly the case and good reason for focusing on things such as more modern or contemporary theories and some of the issues when a new theory comes about. I don't know how that's changed in philosophy of physics, or if that's the case now that more people are considering more modern theories. But
this is definitely changing. So the situation now is very different from the situation when I entered the field, and I think it's going to move in that direction further in the upcoming years. So if you go to a philosophy of physics conference now, you will find quite some talks about string theory, about cosmology and related fields. Now it's established as one important part of the philosophy of physics.
Okay, so now, as having returned to Vienna, having situated yourself in philosophy of physics, and wanting to focus on this issue of some of the more interesting philosophical questions with string theory in particular. Yeah, what was the focus of your research?
So the main I had two main questions I wanted to address. The first question was the one I already briefly characterized. It was the question: why are those theories so influential? Why are they trusted to a quite considerable degree by their exponents, even though they are not empirically confirmed?
Yeah,
that was the first question. And then the second question I found fascinating was the status of scientific realism in the context of string dualities. Mm-hmm. Because string dualities, as I already mentioned, string dualities relate types of theories that have completely different ontologies. And the claim is that those theories are empirically equivalent. So it destroys the fundamental role of ontology. And I thought that's a very interesting message one gets from those kinds of theories. And I thought it's also a philosophically interesting message.
Sure. Was there a particular view, maybe at the time, of theories? I mean, was this essentially the semantic, in the context of philosophy of science, were folks considering these kinds of, like string theory, was there still a maintenance of the syntactic view of models and theories, or was this more semantic view?
In the philosophy of physics, well, I mean, of course, everything that happens in the philosophy of science from the 70s onwards is based on models. It is based on a semantic understanding of theories and stuff. So that's definitely the case. What became very influential then in the 70s and it still plays an important role until today is the scientific realism debate. So the question whether or not our best mature scientific theories are approximately true, and whether scientific objects in those theories refer to something in the external world. And in that debate, so the traditional realist understanding is that you can identify the objects of a theory that refer to something in the external world.
Sure.
So the idea is that is the fact that a theory contains the right objects is what makes it approximately true. That would be ontological scientific realism. And if you look at this duality situation, that's just an interim. That's not a plausible position at all with respect to such a situation. Now, of course, this is not the only argument against ontological realism. There is a branch of scientific realism that's called structural realism that rejects the idea that realism should be based on a fundamental ontology for various reasons. But I felt, and I still feel, that string theory, to the extent you take this, you endorse the theory, of course, string theory provides the most fundamental and most far-reaching rejection of ontological realism in any scientific field. So the idea then, of course, becomes: is it possible to account for the situation in string theory based on structural realist position, or do you need something entirely different? And that's still an interesting.
Absolutely. So why don't we move toward your new work in your new book, or relatively new book, I should say, May 2013. That is as String Theory and the Scientific Method. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Mm-hmm. So that's the book that I wanted to write ever since I switched to philosophy. So kind of everything I did was trying to reach a position where I could write that book. And the idea is to try to explain how scientific theories can be trusted in the absence of empirical confirmation, of any empirical confirmation, or of in the absence of conclusive empirical confirmation. And so what I try to do in this book is I try to identify specific strategies that are particularly powerful in that respect. So what I try to point out is that if you look at all the ideas you may have about a theory in the absence of empirical confirmation, all the ideas that suggest that the theory might be viable, there is one group of arguments that is closer to empirical confirmation and more relevant for assessing the status of the theory than the others. And that's what I call non-empirical theory confirmation. And the point I try to make in the book is that those arguments, if the situation is right, can be really powerful and they cannot replace conclusive empirical confirmation, but they can generate a rather high degree of trust in the theory.
That is fascinating. I mean, so was this idea born out of the fact that you just saw that you assessed that this was going on in physics, in theoretical physics, or is this something that you said you wanted to do this for a long time, and you're kind of like, well, all of these ideas are coming out, but we have no empirical support in terms, but there's still something robust, or there's still something potentially, worthwhile going on in the kinds of arguments that people are making, such that we can and we should perhaps put trust in these theories. And this is what you're trying to articulate. Yeah.
So the first step was, of course, look at the way physicists are arguing in favor of their theory and trying to isolate specific lines of reasoning there. Because the situation is that often those arguments are implicit. They are not part of the official presentation in research papers. You can find them to a certain extent in textbooks. You meet them in private communication and so on, and then you talk sometimes. But they are not considered part of the genuine scientific process. So you don't establish a theory by announcing those arguments. So it's a fairly implicit process, but still it is very powerful because it decides whether or not physicists have trust in a theory or not.
Yeah.
And so the first thing is to identify what those arguments are, or how they are developed by physicists, and the second step then is to reconstruct them philosophically. So to understand what they amount to philosophically and why they can be reliable arguments or rational arguments.
Okay. And how's the book been received by philosophers, by theoretical physicists?
Well, it got quite some extension, I think, quite some attention. I think it's fair to say. And there are those who like the book and those who think that the arguments, physicists' arguments, are adequately represented. And that the way they are represented can also tell something about the status of those theories. And there are others who are critical, who think that those arguments, that the relevance of those arguments is exaggerated, that presenting those arguments may be a problem for the discourse in physics, because those arguments on that basis might get more recognition than they deserve.
There's a caution of giving ground to putting too much stock in theoretical justification. Where do you feel like has the state of the field moved more away from theoretical justification? Is this kind of like something that's attempting to at least save it or to justify it in a way?
I think that if you look at if you compare the situation today with the situation, let's say in 1980s, then it seems clear that to me at least that there is more awareness of those arguments of non-empirical confirmation today than in the 1980s.
Oh,
so they are taken more seriously than back then. Even though it's important to say that these lines of reasoning were always there, that they were not invented 20 or 30 years ago, but they always played a role in the background of understanding physics. But the reason why those arguments are particularly important today, very interesting, is there are two main reasons. Of course, one reason is that in a situation where empirical confirmation is so difficult to attain, you look for other ways of understanding the status of your theory. That's one point. The other point is that in the context of a string theory, but also in the context of inflation, the understanding that theoretical conceptual constraints enforce certain conclusions at the theoretical level is very strong. So what the everyday work of physicists, the string theories, finds oneself in, strongly suggests that there are very few things at the most fundamental level. There are very few things one can do in a consistent way. So the consistency requirements enforce a certain way of doing things. And this inevitability of physics, which was always something that physicists expressed and were thinking about. Mm-hmm. But this inevitability is a particularly strong characteristic of string physics, I would say. That's one reason why these arguments are particularly interesting and particularly influential in string physics.
Well, I'm very excited. I must admit I haven't read the book, but I'm very interested in checking it out. So I will certainly do so in the coming months. Once classes calm down, I'll certainly check it out. No, it seems fascinating. I'm currently working on a class on models in science, and so we deal with these kinds of questions, and at least and that's why I'd asked the models question previously. Yeah. Just dealing with while you admitted like the syntactical view, the received view had been kind of out of vogue since the 70s. It's the case that it might be the case that certain assumptions related to that view still exist in the way people approach the structure of theory. So while no one's really actually trying to form idealized syntactical, structures, in that, kind of, in that framework, folks are still making assumptions of theories independent of these kinds of things. And, it was just interesting to get your approach. So, and what I'm really taking, you seem to really have a pulse, of your experience working as a theoretical physicist, really understanding what it is the physicists are actually doing, and then using that as a way to motivate your work, to justify, what it is they're doing. But also more philosophically, not just in a sociological way, but more so as a starting point to then understand.
Yeah. I do think that for what I'm doing, it is really essential to have a physicist's past, to have worked as a physicist, and to have absorbed the physicist's way of thinking about those issues. I think that's crucial.
Yeah. So lastly, So what's next for you? What's as we wrap up here? Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. But what's in the future for Richard Dawid?
So one, with respect to those issues, to the issue of theory confirmation, what I find very interesting right now is to think more about cosmological issues and about the situation where there is empirical data out there. There's lots of empirical cosmological data out there, but it is very difficult to connect that data conclusively to specific theories. And my feeling is that those concepts of non-empirical confirmation also play an important role there, but they play a slightly different role. They are not on their own, but they mingle with empirical considerations. And so there is something more complex going on, a mixture of empirical evidence and non-empirical considerations that eventually decide whether or not a theory is endorsed or trusted. And so that's one kind of investigation I want to do in the upcoming years.
Oh, I'm very excited. Very excited to hear how that goes. We're about out of time. Is there anything you wanted to mention? Anything you wanted to plug or to say in terms of philosophy of science, or anything at all?
Yeah, maybe one thing I would like to point out is that looking generally at the relation between philosophy and physics, there used to be a high degree of skepticism about philosophy, the philosophy of science, in the physics community. And my feeling is that this is changing a little bit. And it's changing first because I think that philosophy of physics moves closer towards issues that are of interest to the physics community. But it's also the case that the physics community today finds itself in a situation where philosophical questions become more urgent. So there is a rather fundamental issue. Regarding the status of fundamental physics today, how to understand what physicists are actually doing and where they are going. There are other issues like multiverse and entropic reasoning, which are also highly philosophically charged. So I think the situation in physics today is a situation where the interaction between physics and philosophy becomes more interesting than it used to be in recent decades.
Thank you for that. We look forward to the interaction between philosophy and physics and how that plays out in the years to come. Richard, it was been a pleasure chatting with you. I'm sorry we couldn't talk longer, but it's been fascinating to hear about your work and your transition over, and certainly will recommend your book to those in my department, and for the listeners out there, it certainly seems like some important reading.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Great. Well, have a wonderful time throughout the semester, and enjoy Stockholm. And we'll be in touch soon.
Okay.